You're listening to the Swap Society podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Robertson. I interview thought leaders and change makers who are working to create a more sustainable and equitable world through fashion, art, and activism. Join us for a dose of climate optimism as we envision a brighter future. Hey everyone, welcome to the Swap Society podcast. Today, I'm so excited to be talking with Miles Lewis. He's an artist, educator, and community organizer. Welcome to the show, Miles.
Hi, thank you, Nicole.
So where are you talking to us from today, and where are you from originally?
I'm speaking to you from my studio in Woodland Hills in the San Fernando Valley of Los Angeles. This is where I'm from.
Very cool. So I know that you're an artist, but I know that you're also very active in the environmental space and using your art to kind of promote environmental causes. How did you get into that? Talk to us a bit about that.
Sure. So I started off, just drawing and painting. I had a little art school, or I have had a little art school since I was a teenager, and I've sort of built that up over the years. Say about 5-6 years ago, I became very interested in material systems. Right. So waste, water usage, electricity, things that, of course, are part and parcel of environmental conservation and what we could just describe broadly as the green movement going forward. And I've gone through a few transitions where I was interested in zero waste at the beginning and tried to practice it and tried to educate around it. And then I found myself more interested in subjects that covered a few topics and where art could be integrated, right? So more recently, I've been interested in native plants, sort of native landscaping, and how you can beautify and economize and provide wildlife forage and all of these things with sort of as little as possible. I'm very interested in doing as much as possible with as little.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's been kind of that's been the guiding principle in the work that I've done. And do you want a little on sort of what I've done with the art environment connection?
Yeah, I would love to hear about it.
Sure. So in 2020, with 1111 Projects, which is one of the major arts nonprofits out here in the Valley, we secured a grant from the California Arts Council, which is 2 murals that we produced. One had to do with oak ecology in Reseda, and one had to do with soil health in Hollywood. The first was tied to the Theodore Payne Foundation, which works on native plants and has a nursery and all these things. And the second, the soil health one, was associated with Kiss the Ground. It's across from Cafe Gratitude, a well-loved vegan restaurant in the Larchmont area. And so the idea of using art to monumentalize systems that aren't really given monuments. We have a lot of monuments to people. We have monuments to big sort of abstract social ideas like liberty and freedom and equality, and the progress of women, or the progress of Black people, the progress of gay people, whatever it happens to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're pretty good at sort of social justice monumentalization. But as far as monuments to environmental systems, which of course are more fundamental than anything that we happen to do as human beings, it's like soil health, like trees, right? Like water and fire. That has become a major interest of mine. I'm participating in a concert series and associated exhibition at Cal State Northridge here in the where I'll have some pieces up, a triptych of some of the plants that have been especially affected by fire over the past few years. So that'll be sequoia, redwood, and Joshua trees. Mm-hmm. There'll be some musical pieces that go along with it. So for anybody who's interested in kind of like the abstract relationship, or the abstract or the practical relationship between art and environmental concern and raising environmental consciousness, I think that could be a really interesting thing to attend. Whoever, live in the SoCal area. So that's kind of how it's progressed, being kind of like a straightaway educator on zero waste and other environmental topics, to trying to build monuments and culture around that transformation and how we think about the world around us.
Mm-hmm. So I think that we met through the Zero Waste group a while back during that time. And you mentioned that you've kind of moved beyond that into kind of this other kind of greater area, but are you still practicing zero waste personally? How is that integrated?
I really try to reduce waste as much as I can. But I found, and maybe you found in some of your guests, that there's a lot of I think one of the issues that a lot of people have in the environmental movement, environmentally concerned individuals, is you can develop a lot of anxiety that is unfair to yourself, all right, about what you're taking on, what you're putting out there, right? When you know that you're not the problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's these larger upstream influences. So I think that my focus has become much more state and global. While I'm not particularly involved in, say, legislative advocacy, I know that we have had some major laws passed in the past couple of years. Um, it was sort of difficult to sustain.
Mm-hmm.
It was difficult to sort of maintain that personal interest, knowing that it was a larger issue. I mean, some things that I found myself honing in on particular elements that I think are really ripe for transformation. So, like compost.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So, using green bins, right? Getting people to understand something that they already kind of understand, which is that food waste and other kinds of organic waste are full of energy that should be re-entering the system, right? They shouldn't be going to landfills. As far as plastics, using plastics and stuff like that, again, I try to use as little as possible of anything, I suppose. But I've much de-stressed that concern for myself personally. I don't know how it's been for you. I think the last time we were in any kind of contact was probably 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, the same for me, to be honest. And I think for a lot of people, and for me especially during the pandemic, I started having groceries delivered. um, all of the bulk bins at my local store were taken out and they were never replaced. So things that I used to do and that were part of my routine became a lot harder. And I did realize that I was very stressed about every little thing. Oh my God, I shouldn't buy that. Or, oh, I bought that, but my kids really wanted to eat it. And I remember actually, this was a few years ago, my kids were a little younger, and a little kid at my son's preschool said, Pierce is always eating our seaweed. He's always eating everybody's seaweed snacks. I wouldn't buy them because they come in so much plastic.
Right.
I stopped buying them because I was like, oh, there's so much waste. But my kid really likes to eat that snack. And, as far as snacks go, it's not, it's on the healthier side. I mean, I guess there's a lot of salt, but, and then I started kind of reevaluating some of those things as well and thinking, okay, well, I think that there are certain areas, like you mentioned, kind of zeroing in on, like we always make our own coffee at home. So I'm not going out and getting a disposable coffee cup every day, and something where it's like, okay, I've zeroed in on certain things. I mean, my wardrobe is very sustainable, obviously. I own a clothing swap business. I haven't really bought new clothes since 2010 with like a few exceptions here and there. So I'm trying to be gentler with myself, I guess is what I'm getting at, and being a little less neurotic about it, because it is really difficult to live that way. And to your point, yes, I believe that individual changes are impactful, but it doesn't fully solve the problem.
And I think it's worth considering it as a part of like personal evolution, right? So you become extremely conscious of something, right? You have the burden of consciousness with these things, and as you did with clothing, I'm sure, right? Suddenly you're aware. And then you realize that you taking on all this emotionally is unfair, and it's symptomatic of the kind of global sort of broadcast culture that we live in, right? So we can listen to the news. It doesn't have to do anything with sustainability, but we can listen to the news and we can take on the pain of other people. We can take on these issues that are happening around the world, none of which is helpful, I think, or it's only helpful if it's very, very well contextualized, which is very difficult for us to do, especially for kids. And I found myself educating kids. I'm working with middle and high school students and providing these zero waste presentations. And I think it becomes moralistic, right? You end up with kids thinking, oh, well, he's bad because he uses plastic water bottles, or, whatever it is. It ends up becoming very reductive. It's hard to do this in a holistic way. And I found that with some of these other disciplines, like, we're doing this, I was saying, I'm doing this triptych and this concert series around fire. Part of our objective with that is to change people's idea of fire. We think of it as a scary thing. And we also think of it as inherent environmental destruction. Many human beings do. I think more people who are a little more informed understand that fire is part of the cycle here in California. It's part of the cycle in many fire-prone parts of the world. But the degree to which we should be allowing fire, I think, is quite striking to a lot of people. So as I was doing my triptychs and working on this project, I spoke with a lot of fire ecologists, working mostly in like the UC and the CSU system. And they were giving me, pieces of information that I think are a little overwhelming to people. One point was about the sequoia range, right? We love our sequoia trees. And we're afraid that they could go extinct and all these things. So one of these scientists and his colleagues had released a paper earlier this year that pointed out that probably within the Sierran range, there would be, in natural conditions, 60 to 70% fewer trees than there are currently. That's because we have conserved some of these trees to death. That's some of the thinking, right? It's not, climate change is a force multiplier, and of course it dries soils out, and it causes certain issues sort of year to year, right? It increases the significance of drought and perhaps the intensity of fire. However, what has killed these sequoia trees is likely the fact that there is so much overgrowth that fires are able to reach into the canopy of the tree, that, as one scientist said, there are just more straws in the ground. So our vision of a beautiful, healthy forest is one that is sort of overgrown, right, where greenery sort of covers everything in, is very human. It isn't ecologically sound.
Interesting.
And even burnt landscapes. We look at a burnt landscape and we see tragedy, but burnt landscapes are an inherent part of the forest system. So new sequoias, as new redwoods, germinate through fire. It requires a certain amount of land. It requires the ash content in the soil. And a lot of these trees are used by birds. Burnt trees specifically are used by birds and many other fauna as houses and other sort of elements within an extended ecological pattern, or as a sort of an extended biome. So a lot of these scientists, they look at a burnt landscape, like a well-burnt landscape, you might say, and they think that's a beautiful thing, right? It's such an important part. In the same way that, like, a corpse, I don't mean a human corpse necessarily, but just a degenerating body, right? A biodegrading body is full of life. One of the ways that they determine, and this is not a suggestion that any of it happened, but one of the ways that they'll detect, like a dead body in a forest, maybe it's a hiker who fell off a cliff or something, is they'll often see a patch of wildflowers around the body.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
It's because it's so full of nutrition, right? It goes back into the soil, the whole idea of sort of the soil cycle. So it's very much like a coming to terms with death idea. Most of these trees historically are not killed by fire. I mean, I imagine you visited the sequoia and you'll see huge fire scars on trees, right? Huge. They can be 30 feet tall or something, right? As they're reaching up the column of the tree. And so that understanding that some of our anxiety, sort of our conservative anxiety as conservation-minded people, like don't lose it. We're going to lose it. Don't cut down a tree. Don't allow the fire to happen. Don't allow this animal to kill this animal, or whatever it is. Don't allow plastic in this case or that case. Let's use wood and paper and other things that are actually much more materially intensive in many cases than plastic, which I'm sure you've heard. Like paper bags are much more materially intensive in many cases than plastic bags. That has really helped me to remove myself from that personal anxiety, that burden of consciousness, and realize things are much more complicated than I think. There are a lot of trade-offs with anything. Like, I wouldn't want to go completely to paper bags versus plastic bags. That would probably be worse. Just because of all the resources that would require. And the fact that plastic makes things lighter in transport. I mean, I had that discussion with people who work on sort of transport and delivery systems, right? So plastic is much better to use than large wood and steel crates in terms of the amount of gas that's used, right, by trains and planes and ships. So it's very complicated. If we want to live in like a fully resourced global society where everybody has a chance, we want to, of course, have as small an environmental footprint as possible, but there are gradients, and there do seem to be levels at which transformation can happen, right? So we use plastic for now, we use natural gas for now, and then hopefully, as soon as we can, with as little sort of negative impact on people and the planet, we can get to that place where we're using things as efficiently as possible and with as optimal benefit. So that was a lot of it. Is I got freaked out about plastics. I got freaked out, like so many people in the zero waste space. and then realizing this is way too inward. I'm looking way too much at my own actions and feeling like, and needing a sense of control that I do not have, but I can play a part in helping people think a little more broadly about this stuff, which is part of why I got to native plants and compost and things, because those seem so much more. It's such an obvious good, and the system's already set up.
Yeah.
It's hard. I can't change the plastics industry. I mean, that's such a limited impact. But as an Angelino, like I started the native plant fair here in Tarzana, and it was a huge blowout success last year. That's such a clearer transition. People are already making it. People are able to go, okay, I thought lawns were beautiful. I understand the issues with lawns. Lawns are still pretty. It's fine. How can we get to a kind of landscape that I can enjoy, that also all of these primary and sideline benefits that allows part of the new California landscape. Same with composting. So I think it's really important as environmentally minded people to have wins. Wins personally, and in terms of the circle that we're able to cultivate around ourselves. So that's a lot of where my head's gone.
That's awesome. Yeah, we owned a home. We sold it a few years ago, but we completely xeriscaped it. So it did have, the big useless front lawn, and it was kind of a hilly lawn. So it wasn't even a play space for kids. It's like, this doesn't need to be grass. And we used all native plants, and it looked beautiful. And over time, it just kept flourishing. And one thing that was really interesting, we started to get a lot of lizards. And I remember I was at some local fair, and there was a lizard guy, and I was talking about it with him. So California, right? Like, there's a lizard guy at the fair, because we were curious, like, oh, we have all of these lizards. We're curious about it. And he said that that's actually the sign of good soil health, that we must have over time, because of all of the changes that we made, improve the soil health of our property. And so that was actually a really great sign that we had those types of lizards, living on our property. I don't remember what they were called. Sorry, I don't retain lizard names very well, but
are they alligator lizards? I forget what the most common of the lizards in SoCal are, but in any case.
I don't know, but we had like a whole bunch of them, and yeah, so that felt good. It was like, oh, we made this somewhat small change, and it did have an impact on that 7,000 square foot patch of land that we lived on at that time. And so, I think that I really think a lot about soil health from a fashion standpoint also, because, I'm sure you've heard this, that, we have fewer than 60 harvests left, supposedly. I don't know if you've
I have heard that. I wonder about stuff like that. I've become very skeptical of projections.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
We're really bad. This, I think, is a truism that most scientists and historical observers would agree with, which is we're very bad at projecting things. We're very good at adapting to things.
That's interesting. Sure.
I mean, it's true. We've adapted to extraordinary, civilizations have gone under, right? Many times over. But we can somehow adapt. So I don't know. I mean, do you believe that when people say that?
Well, it's interesting. I really got into it at an event that, I don't know if you know Bonnie Wright, but she was doing some events. I had spoken at one of her events, and then I went to some other ones. This was all before the pandemic, but there was an event where the focus was, I spoke at the panel on fashion, obviously, but I went to one of her events where it was all about soil health. And there were people that were local that work with soil and compost and all of that were all talking about that topic. And somebody there brought that up, and this was a few years ago, but it always kind of stuck with me. And maybe it's not a correct projection, but I think that maybe what it does is kind of, I don't know, I guess I felt a sense of urgency about it, thinking like, we've degraded the soil so much that, if we don't change the way that we interact with our soil, that we may not be able to grow food in that
I think
soil any longer.
I mean, it's kind of always true, right? And sort of like we speak of sea levels rising.
Mm-hmm.
So people will have to move, but also people have, and not that that's a small thing, the sea level rising, but people have always moved, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if like the sea level is, I know that the projections vary widely on that, but let's say in Manhattan, it's between 0.5 meter and 5 meters. Again, I'm not sure if those are the numbers, but let's say that that's up through 2100. I mean, we'll figure it out. Like, that is not to say it's not expensive. That is not to say we won't have to adapt, but we have to adapt at any time. Like with California, we speak about the Colorado River, as losing water. We speak of drought here in the West, and certainly climate change is a force multiplier. But we have a lot of people living in Arizona and Nevada, and a lot of people have been living in California for a while, or the loss of the Great Salt Lake in Utah. And a lot of it is just how people are using water, so things will have to change. We always sort of take ourselves to the limit, and then we have to change what we do. I mean, back in the 60s and 70s, as I'm sure you're well aware, people were very concerned about overpopulation. There was the idea of the population bomb by Paul Ehrlichman, right, who's an entomologist who studied butterflies. It came out in the late 60s. I think it was published by the Sierra Club Press, or whatever their press marker was. And everybody, in a very bipartisan fashion, were very concerned about overpopulation. And it's not really that issue anymore. People don't really talk about, people talk about decline. People talk about losing population. I mean, what we forgot in that conversation, and what was really a problem for environmentalists, is that it became personal. It became about human beings, and human beings kind of as insects or an invasive species, specifically non-white people, frankly, right? It had a serious racist tinge to it. And so what helped to correct for it was the Green Revolution that happened in the late 60s and early 80s, right? Major agricultural reform, which is showing some of its issues now, people talking about the loss of agrable land over the next century. But I have a lot of faith in humanity, frankly. And we know it's an issue. People know it's an issue, and we have the technological interventions for it. You have major advocacies like Kiss the Ground that are focused on regenerative health. I follow another organization called Landcore, which works with, I think they work with Kiss the Ground, but Associated Space, where they've been pushing for major regenerative policy elements in the Farm Bill that I believe is up before Congress this year. And they're very bullish about it, because there are a lot of Republicans, in addition to a lot of Democrats, who are supportive of these changes. Like, they know it's an issue. They might have different senses of urgency and different senses of how the intervention should happen and how government should be spending its funds. But I think that there's a lot of value, as someone who works a lot with kids, there's a lot of value in avoiding apocalyptic discussion. Because I think when you speak with a lot of scientists about this stuff, like, the consensus tends to be, these are serious issues. They're not really apocalyptic, right? Like, as far as I understand climate change, with the current science and climate change, yes, it's a serious issue. Yes, there will be losses in a number of different ways. But, we want to always push for the answer as soon as we can. I mean, again, I'm speaking for myself, right? As far as I'm understanding what I'm hearing. But we should do it out of a sense of optimistic sort of human solidarity around solving these issues, because we're good at solving issues. I mean, we have solved a lot of issues. There are many more people in poverty. Many more people are fed. Many more people live in what we would describe as the wealthy world, right? Where they're able to, a certain amount of freedom that never existed for their families, 100, 150 years ago. So I think all of that has to be seen in context. I know it's sort of a separate thing, but I've become sensitive as somebody who is very interested in religions and belief systems, and how people sort of orient their society around belief, of the danger of an unchecked religiosity and environmental thinking. Like the need to save, right? The sort of like the puritanical preservation instinct that I think a lot of environmentalists will start cultivating. When I speak with a lot of scientists, they don't have it. They tend to be more practical, because they realize that there's a political side to this that I'm identifying with. And if you don't have perhaps a strong cosmic religious identity, it's easy to take on, Mother Nature as the goddess, right? And everything's about preserving Mother Nature and cultivating Mother Nature and going organic and going green in a way that you understand. A lot of it's holdovers from the hippie era that perhaps had more to do with the time and space than they did with an actually holistic understanding of how we can exist on a living planet with other human beings in as peaceful a way. So all of that is to say that I've come to feel that it's more complex than I'm able to understand, than I was practicing it a few years ago. And where I'm able to find clear interventions, I'm leaning into them and using my support them. But like with the mural for soil health, like what's bad about, monumentalizing soil health? There's nothing pseudoscientific or propagandistic about it. If we can make soil healthy, it is almost universal, right? For all. So that's sort of a extended conversation of what I've come to feel.
That's really interesting, and I think that thinking back to soil health and kind of that notion of how are we treating the soil, what are we using it for? It does make me think about the fashion conversation also, because a lot of the fibers that we wear are grown, and if you look at how much we're over consuming textiles, for example, is that really the best way we could be using the soil to grow cotton, for example?
Sure.
That is, unless it's organic, which it usually isn't, is often laden with pesticides. And then, we're using those limited harvests, which maybe they're not as limited as that number. But that being said, I think it helps shape kind of the perspective of it, right? That we can't just do whatever we want and not have consequences, right? And maybe instead of growing so much excess cotton to feed these kind of ridiculously fast cycles of fashion consumption, with so many things just winding up in a landfill after, one or two wears or no wears in many cases, that, as a society, maybe we can reprioritize so that we can use that land for food, for example, which is required. It's like, we need some clothing, but we don't need that much, but we're always going to need food. And so I always find it interesting to think of, beyond even just kind of land for food, because I don't think a lot of people realize how much land is used to grow clothing, for example.
Yeah, or, paper, forestry,
sure,
products, and timber and all these things. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's difficult to message, though, sort of like economical thinking, right? Sort of efficiency thinking, and how that can be a beautiful and wonderful thing. I mean, as you have certainly encountered, a lot of people like the idea of, vintage and swap, but it isn't the moneymaker, right? So that complicates, right? And I think if somebody were able to do that, and I know there are online businesses that do that, but if somebody were able to really do that at scale, that seems so much to be the trick. I mean, with that understanding, so what clothing content? I mean, I understand like vintage, naturally made clothing is probably, is the most sustainable to acquire, perhaps. But for new clothing, given that new clothing will be made, regardless of how we feel about it, given that will be made, I mean, what's the most sustainable sort of material practice with that?
Well, that's a trick question, right? So I won't purport to be able to say like this certain fabric is like the most sustainable, but I will say that personally, of the things that I do buy brand new, like underwear and socks, for example, I try to buy organic cotton that's fair trade, so that it's a better choice than, maybe some of the other things that are out there. For example, I buy most of my underwear and socks from Pact. They manufacture with fair trade practices and they use organic cotton.
What are the water and land footprints for those?
Well, that's a really, I mean, that's the thing. It's very complex, right? Is that really the best choice? I mean, it's the best choice that I can make for myself right now at this moment. Like, I like wearing cotton. If I'm going to buy new cotton, I try to make sure that it's the best that I can find at the moment. But yeah, when you really dig into kind of like more of a life cycle analysis, water usage and land usage and all of those things, it does get a lot more complicated. I think that one of the most important things that people can do, regardless of how they acquire their items, is to use them for as long as possible,
Sure.
to mend them if they need mending instead of just throwing them away, trying to get as much life out of their things. Ultimately, I know that for me personally, I do like wearing natural fibers. I prefer them in general, and I have for a long time. That being said, we accept all garments at Swap Society because I really think that all brands, any garment, regardless of if it's fast fashion or if the tag is missing and we don't even know who made it, it's kind of like it doesn't matter if it's a wearable garment, we will take it, that's in good condition. And I think that just trying to push for a more of like use what's already there as much as possible. Our hashtag is, swap before you shop. I don't think people are ever going to completely stop shopping or buying new things, to your point. But I think that if we can slow down our consumption of brand new things, that's ultimately going to have an impact. But it's hard. It's difficult, I think, for the average person out there who is being marketed to constantly that there's this need, like you need to have the newest trend. You have to, you can't wear the same thing on Instagram twice, or all of these ridiculous things that are pervasive in Western culture right now. But we're just trying to, hopefully promote a slowing down of things and a more, more mindfulness. How can you make at least some better choices, and cumulatively, hopefully that helps to kind of shift perspective a little bit. But I don't expect people to be as extreme as me. I hardly buy anything except groceries, for my house, for my family. And some people sometimes laugh, ha ha ha, you never buy anything. And they, like, oh, Nicole, she's so quirky and weird or whatever. And maybe that's true. But, I don't expect that everybody will go as far as I have gone. But if more people do a little bit more of it, and embrace this idea that there's a ton of, we've overproduced so much stuff that, maybe thrifting or shopping secondhand or getting something from a neighbor. I'm really active in my Buy Nothing group, that all of these things, once you start to do it, it gets easier and easier. I think it's like anything in sustainability, don't strive for perfection, but just strive to make some better choices. And then, over time, maybe you add on a little more and a little more, and then, you become more and more sustainable over time.
Sure. Well, I definitely see that at the individual scale. I mean, my feeling as an art teacher, somebody who teaches perception, really. Perception, the use of the imagination is, I think, just kind of letting your freak flag fly. You are doing this individually. It impacts, and being in contact with people constantly. I mean, it's important to be very social, I think. If you have a way of living that, like, I'm gay, and as part of like the gay rights movement, I'm sure you're well aware, there was the whole like coming out movement, right? Coming out of the closet was, the big rallying cry in the 70s and 80s. And then, of course, AIDS commandeered a lot of things, and it became a very different political sort of a messaging center. Mm-hmm. But, you just have to be gay in society. Right, you have to be publicly queer, and then people are like, no, my uncle's gay, my cousin's gay. No, this is a way that people can be. It is how you normalize things, right, to society, and doing it, deliberately, politically like that, and knowing that it's not like you're turning anybody gay, right? It's just that they're getting okay with it. And so when changes come their way, like, definitely a lot of straight people now think very differently about marriage. Mm-hmm. Than they did 40 years ago. I know that the gay rights movement and a lot of sort of associated cultural content and programming has altered things. Mm-hmm. How kids think about sexuality and gender, how we understand boys and girls in society. These things have changed because of the feminist movement, because of the gay rights movement, because of all these things that have kind of worked together with people saying, no, this is, I'm burning my bra, or no, I'm gay, I have sex with other men, and that's fine, right? That's mm-hmm. natural. And being that explicit about it is important. So I think, like with compost, like compost is kind of like, of course, there's nothing grossly political about it. Like there's no one who's like religiously opposed to compost. think that's one of the advantages that environmentalists have, right? So I think it's important to look at the success of other campaigns, social rights campaign, or I'll just say social campaigns, where 0% of the population was in favor of gay marriage in 1955. I'm sure 0%. And now it's 75 or whatever it is right now. And a good thing about environmental stuff is that almost all of it is positive at a baseline. Like, people like the idea of trees, people like the idea of clean water, people like the idea of sort of responsible use of materials, and through people, that is a general social value. And so I think being able to lean into those and represent those will impact those that are coming up with companies, new ways of forming the economy, fresh ways of socializing that will help to incorporate this into the world. Again, part of why the native plants thing has been such an inclination for me, because those who have landscapes have thought seriously about it. Many people have torn out their grass. Many people have done it badly. They've thrown in gravel and fake grass and all that stuff, right? And then you have people who are really trying to put forward the idea of, no, we can live in a wildland urban, a wildlife city, right? But we have all these beautiful benefits of inviting these plants into our homes. So that's how I think about it at sort of the larger social scale. I've lost some interest in sort of individual results, other than cleanliness. I don't buy much at all, and I really value the time and the money that I save by, like, I also, I don't drink. I've never done drugs. I don't really like traveling very much. Like, I have a lot of attitudes that are sort of native to me that have made it easier, and I imagine that's the case for you too. Other people are very different, and we can tolerate each other's differences, but for some people, they really get a lot out of getting a gift or giving a material gift. You know what I mean? And I'm sure you have people in your family for whom that is serious. Like, it's substantial to get a gift or to give a gift. Whereas for me, I couldn't care. Like, I couldn't care less about that. I don't really care about traveling. Like I was just saying, my husband, he loves to travel. So he's a school teacher, and when he's off, he'll go traveling with friends, or he'll visit, a friend in the UK or something like that. I'm busy out here, but also I cultivate these little spaces where I can go out and watch butterflies or something like that. Like, that's enough for me. That's enough. So I think that is our freakishness, perhaps, right? Is that we are just not, I think some of it is just that we're just not prone to the same enticements which doesn't make us better people, right? But we're just not prone to the same kinds of material or materialistic enticements that a lot of people are. But my counter to that is I really do encourage a very substantial materialism. Like, I teach people drawing and painting, like the value of making the value of crafting, making a well done thing, cooking well, enjoying the natural spaces around you. Trees aren't furniture, right? They're living beings that you live with, getting to know them, watching them over the seasons. Like, that's high materialism. It's not consumerism at all, right? It's not consumption, but it is material. It is very much like the material of the earth. And so that's often been my counter. And I think that I know that that's been impactful for people, or for some of my students, and sort of the little community that I've been able to create here. So that's some of my response to that idea of having an impact as an individual is it will hit the right people, and they'll sort of carry it forward.
Do you find from your experience that creative people are more drawn to these concepts on average, or do you think that that's unrelated? What has your experience been there?
Yeah, I think they're drawn to these concepts, whether they're interested in sort of a zero waste practice or whatever. I mean, I think they're more willing to change up their lives because they've seen the benefit in their own work, right? It requires often a lot of sort of self-alteration and a lot of experimentation on a personal level to get good at art in a way that you recognize. And so I've noticed there are many more vegans in sort of the arts community. There are many more people who are, that identify a little more broadly or out of the box in terms of sexuality and gender. And definitely with environmental topics, I have plenty of artist friends for whom that is a subject. Part of it is, our understanding of beauty all comes from nature, right? I mean, that is the standard for beauty universally at all times, right? Like, you can't make a painting that's more beautiful than a beautiful tree. Like, you can't do it. You can't make a representation of something that is more beautiful than a person. So I think that awareness that you're constantly facing, it's a constant reinforcement that the world is this beautiful thing that you're constantly returning to study. And I do think that provides a good template for environmental thinking. So yeah, I don't know, statistically across culture what that looks like, but I would imagine that artists in general are more sort of self-identified environmentalists than, say, used car salesmen or something. Used cars are better than new cars, perhaps.
That's true. That they actually are much more sustainable than new cars.
Much more than a Tesla, so far as I understand. Much get an old Toyota than a new Tesla if you're thinking about systematic impact. But it's complicated. It's all trade-offs.
It is very complicated. It is. And all of these things are. And I think that for me, just having conversations with, different types of people who are thinking about these problems all from unique perspectives or working on them in different ways is important and exciting for me, because I think that it just does give me more inspiration as well, in terms of just, I don't know, I don't feel like I'm in a silo. It's nice to know that, like, oh, somebody's working on this thing that I haven't even really considered in that way, or, just being more open to these different perspectives and approaches. Kind of back to that, what you had mentioned in the beginning, even, I think that it's so important for us to not try to enforce perfectionism on other people, or be moralistic about it. Like, oh, I see you have a plastic bottle of water, so you must be a terrible person.
You're lazy. But it ends up looking like, right?
But it does translate too to, like, I rarely buy plastic bottled water, but sometimes I can't avoid it for a certain reason or whatever. But then I often find myself explaining myself, like, oh, I had to buy this. It was an emergency, or whatever it might be. And it's like, okay, well, I don't really owe anyone an explanation, but it's like that self-critical kind of voice inside of my head where it's like, oh, I'm not being perfect at this, but I think that it's better to be imperfectly sustainable and just trying, and mindful, and that's more productive.
Explaining process is really important. If you say, this is why I do what I do. Because, I think people can get scared of that. They can feel like they're being judgmental or they're being judged. But saying, this is how I've thought about it. I haven't thought about it perfectly, I'm sure, right? Having that kind of humility. It's a problem with sort of people identifying as anything in particular, right? Like, none of us have a good, it's all abstract. We have these, racial and gender and sexual identity and these ways that we identify politically and stuff like that. And all of these are very much in flux, and most of them are all human categories. So I think that, noting that discussion is an inherent part of it, right? If we're going to understand something better and enjoy it better, I try to place, like, pleasure and beauty sort of at the forefront, because I think that draws people in much more than moral responsibility.
Sure.
And you can adapt to each other, right? If you can connect them, beauty and moral responsibility, I mean, that's a wonderful world. That's often how I'm thinking about it.
So I know that you said that you don't, consume a lot, which, I would expect. And I know you're not necessarily in fashion, but you are an artist and you do appreciate visual beauty. And even if you didn't have those feelings about the world, everybody wears clothes, right? And so I always love a good fashion love story. And I ask everyone, do you have a favorite piece of clothing in your closet? And if so, what is it and what do you love about it?
It's right here, actually. It's I have to throw it in the wash. But it's like a blue overshirt. I don't think I think it has some poly content, but I believe it's from the 70s or 80s. So it's an older piece. But it's just a really nice color. I've been told it works well with my eyes, and I've been told I'm a swimmer. So it has those advantages. And then it's just very comfortable. It's good for most seasons, and it has little pockets with Velcro. So it kind of captures all of it. It's like teacherly. It's a good sort of artist garment. It's very clean and pretty, um, and simple.
Do you have a whole set of like painter clothes? You know, the stuff that you just wear?
I should probably introduce something else to him.
Okay.
I got an old garment. It is an old-fashioned painter's blouse or smock. So I'll put it on here. It makes you kind of look like a judge from the 18th century.
I love it.
But I just needed something that was very functional that would cover my entire body.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm graduating, right? It has elasticized wrists. It has these like cute little buttons.
I love it.
So this is, that, and of course, we have aprons and other kinds of smocks and stuff like that.
Sure. I went to an art exhibit once. This was so long ago. I'm from Chicago, and I think it might have been somewhere in Michigan or the Michiana area, but there was an exhibition featuring different artists' pants. The person that put it together got a bunch of different artists' pants and just hung them up for everyone to see. And I always thought that was kind of
Covered in paint.
Covered in paint. Yeah.
Yeah.
But in a different way. It was interesting. I mean, I remembered it. Obviously, it stuck with me. So.
Well, I think artists do tend to have a less precious. I mean, a lot of my artist friends, of course, they have their artist clothes. Right, so they have stuff that can get dirty.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them are fashionable. Usually, it's like kooky. I mean, they're not trying to be fashionable, right? Usually, it's kooky.
Yeah, they have their own style. They're not following fashion trends.
They're not following. That's what I should say. It's not trend.
Yeah.
They're usually having fun. And I remember when I was a teen, being kind of I was really impacted by David Bowie. And I was like 13, 14. It made me feel very affirmed as a queer kid, and it also I loved rock and roll, so he was kind of the guy. And being sometimes having like little glam things or little gothy elements to how I would dress, and then I became very kind of normcore for years. And now both my brother and I, we kind of have like a flowy, not a cape thing, but I don't know. I've thought more about it recently. Like, this is something to play with, and I can definitely use vintage clothing to do it. But sort of mixing and matching and kind of composing how I present myself for fun. I mean, a lot of it is just sort of just pleasure. So, and kids respond to. I have a lot of kids. I have artsy kids in my classes, so a lot of them have funky, kooky things that they wear. So I'm aware of it to some degree. But yeah, it's almost all through sort of a sort of absurd styling. Just people kind of have fun with clothes.
I mean, that's what has always drawn me to it. I think that in my day-to-day, I'm a lot more kind of classic or whatever, but I love having fun with fashion as well. I like it as a form of expression. So I think that, keeping the fun parts is what matters to me, but also being more mindful about it.
Well, we see it with food, right? We see it, and not to go too long on any of it, but food is like with vegan alternatives or plant-based, right? Like you really have to make it enjoyable. Like we have to be able to say, actually, if we do it plant-based, I mean, there's so many more plants that we can experiment with than the meat products that we use. Right? This is a lot of fun. Like this is an adventure we can go on, trying to make food that is more compassionate, but also just much more inventive than what we're typically eating here in America. So I think that's almost always the tack to take. It's an exciting adventure.
Have you heard of The Vegan Butcher, that book?
I've heard, yeah.
It's really, it embodies that for me. It's like super fun. Like I made sushi out of watermelon.
Oh, yeah.
And it was so bizarre because it really, it was like eating sushi. It was really crazy. My husband and I both were kind of blown away. It's like, how is this watermelon? It was super fun. It took some effort, but it's very creative. It's like, how can you take different plants and make different things? So I highly recommend that if you feel like having some fun in the kitchen.
I mean, that's great. And that gets to it exactly, which is like, it's creativity. Right, we're asking people we've been given a lot of industrial defaults, which have provided us a lot of benefit. So I don't even want to discount them, right? I mean, our lives are so much better because of petrochemicals. which is not to say that we need to keep using chemicals for the next 100 years, but they are, right?
Yeah.
There's no argument that you can really have against them in that way. Our lives have been based on petrochemical production. So, okay, we understand that. All right. How do we carry this legacy forward in the grand human adventure of bringing everyone forward, like a more equal society, a more liberated society, one where we can enjoy our environment to the utmost? So that requires a lot of creative thinking. So I love things like, the Vegan Butcher and others. It just, if it's there rather than the kind of the puritanical way of approaching things, right, where it's fun, creative, sort of fresh human values, that it can go a long way, I think.
Yeah. So what's inspiring you right now?
Inspiring. Another little environmental thing that I got involved with recently was, have you heard of Recompose? They've been working on making human composting legal around the United States. Yeah, so they passed a bill in Washington State, and California actually just passed a bill. So now you can have your body organically reduced. So once you die, you get like put in a number of different ways of doing it, of course. But it's kind of like how cattle are composted on farms, on agricultural operations, where your body's put like alfalfa and all these other things, and it becomes very rich soil fairly rapidly that can be used for regenerating the earth, right? So that I thought, well, that's a simple thing, right? That's another good thing where it's like people don't really want to be burnt up. They don't want to be buried in a casket, so they'd rather be burnt. It's cheaper, all those things. But burning bodies, like, it doesn't even make sense, really, unless it's a total like religious ritual, which it is, of course, in many cultures, but or in a few cultures. But yeah, so I've been advocating for them a little bit. That's been inspiring. They've had a lot of success because it is a very bipartisan, sort of like cross-cultural thing. Like, people should be allowed to do that. People should be allowed to decompose their body in the earth, right? So that's been a nice little environmental win. Other inspiration has been listening to a lot of music. I think it's worth talking about some of like the technological interventions that we can enjoy. We all use Spotify, right? But or so many of us do. But it's incredible that we have this much access. I mean, I'm inspired by the idea of like what is accessible to us as affordably. Hopefully people can be well compensated. Always want to advocate for that, but how much can be provided to us affordably that enriches our lives? Like, create all these Spotify playlists with all these songs that I never really would have been able to find or encounter. So I find myself constantly inspired by new music that I find. There are a lot of like great 70s soundtracks. And they're not all like goofy 70s, sort of string and sort of synth. But I recommend, really trying to do a deep dive. If there's a song on your playlist where you're like, I really like this, but I don't really understand the genre it's coming from, right? Or I don't really know the sort of artist's historical background, like, use Spotify or whatever service you've got just to go deeper into it. I mean, there's just a lot of pleasure in that. That is materialistic in that positive way, right?
Yeah.
It's so, but it goes through our bodies, right? We feel it in the vibration of molecules. But it helps music helps to constantly reattach us to the idea that what is really valuable is not the object, right? It's the space between things, right? It's the relationship of parts. It's the quality of the craft. So those are very general. I mean, everybody likes music, really, but that I find that is sort of a constant inspiration.
And we touched on this a little bit, and I know that you like to skew more in, less apocalyptic and more positive and hopeful and optimistic. But in this time of, kind of this climate anxiety that a lot of people are experiencing, what keeps you feeling hopeful about the future?
Well, like you were saying earlier, that you get benefit from seeing that other people are doing things, right? This podcast allows you to reach out to people. I mean, a lot of people are concerned about these topics. It's so easy to feel isolated. No, just people are really good at adapting. It's just so easy to be apocalyptic. I mean, I don't know if this sounds like a climate skeptic or a sort of denialist talking. But one thing that hit me, that I heard being discussed, I think it was like on KPCC locally, right? One of the NPR stations. I think they had Stephen Koonin on, who has this book that is called unsettled, where he's a physicist and he believes in climate change and everything, but he's part of sort of the skeptic branch about the impacts of climate change. And, I want to be educated on the range of thinking, but something that really hit me was over the past more than a century, we've already warmed by a degree, a little bit more than a degree. And we expect another, 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming under a moderate scenario. That's my understanding, right? 2.5 degrees Celsius or so in total over the pre-industrial level, not the 8 degrees Celsius or whatever that you'd sometimes get in like these nightmare scenarios. That's more, that doesn't seem to be the way we're going. And in the past 100 years, we've seen this warming, but it's also been the greatest period of human flourishing in the history of the species, right? I mean, so much has developed. So many adaptations have had to be implemented. The idea that we'd have this many human beings 100 years ago would be completely impossible. People would live in incredible poverty and famine, right? And it required all these technological interventions. It required a faith in science and industry. So the sort of qualified view that I feel that I have as a lay person, as somebody who's not a technologist here, but understanding that even the people who are experts in these fields, it's so many fields together. Nobody is a total master expert, right, of climate and industry and all this stuff. It's so much going on, and so much requires very advanced computer modeling that has to change all the time. The fact that we've been able to have this much advancement with 1 degree of warming, if we have another 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming, absolutely, I'd rather not have it, right? Understanding the risks that have been detailed, the loss of certain species, the loss of certain environments, and the encroachments on human life. But it seems incredible to me that we're not going to be able to adapt. And if we keep having these conversations, if we bring a positive environmental viewpoint that people are able to really apply themselves to and collect, with another 1.5 to 2 degrees warming, this is not the end of the world. This is this is not the Greta Thunberg scenario of where things can go. And as an educator, kids have so many mental health challenges. To give them any unfounded sense that they don't have a future because we are scared and don't know how to deal with this, this mix of media and scientific and pseudoscientific information, like absolutely, we should be raising a generation of environmentalists, but they should be very well informed. And this is a positive message because it is, right? This is what we can do. To make it apocalyptic, to make it about having 2 years left, 5 years left, 10 years left, when you're a 10-year-old, it's not okay. Like it's actually
not going to help them.
It's not helping them. It's actually a real problem. And I've observed it with kids. So I'm not non-apocalyptic out of a sense that it's just better to be optimistic, power of positivity. I don't think it's scientific to be apocalyptic here, as far as what I've heard from scientists. And I don't think it's fair to kids at all. I think it can be and has been a major contributor to mental health issues and a feeling of alienation in society. If you feel like society is going to collapse around you because people screwed up over the past 150 years. I mean, one final point there, we talk about the drought in California. And I reach out to this woman who works in the Water in the West Institute at Stanford, and just asked her pointed questions. How am I supposed to think about this as somebody who is concerned about these things? It can feel very dire. Any of these, fire, drought, all this stuff. And I said, are we not going to be able to live in California at some point? Like, is this the end of like having, 38 million or whatever we've got still, 38, 40 million? And she said, not at all. Like, our systems are so bad. She's like, we are so wasteful with water. We can absolutely make this work in California. She's speaking as a policy expert. We can absolutely do this. She pointed me to other people to talk to, but she was like, there's some great, movement happening over here. We need other movement over here. She's like, I understand the concern, but that's not the concern. The concern isn't the end of human life. It's not the end of human society. It's not that we are living on the brink in that way. It's understanding that we are perhaps always living on the brink. Water is very irregular in California and has always been, but we know exactly what to do. Like, we know how this works, and we're headed in the direction, right? So we can go a little faster, but that feeling of urgency, I think that can be important for like legislators sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's what keeps me hopeful, is the knowledge that actually perhaps the most effective and the most realistic forward path exists in sort of positive communal movement. And there are millions and tens of millions of people who are concerned about the subject and working in an interdisciplinary fashion to correct these things.
Mm-hmm.
So over time, I have to say, I started off very darkly when I got interested in environmentalism or environmental subjects and zero waste in 2016, 2017. But over time, I feel like I've become much more positive. I don't know how the path has been for you.
I've been trying to focus on what's positive because I did notice myself kind of spiraling downward a little bit. And so I'm trying to be more mindful of how much news I consume. Like, I like to be informed. I just try to balance it. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I need a break from the news. I need a break from reading these articles about what's going on with climate, and then, recharge, and then, okay, back into it, and that sort of thing. That's great to hear about the drought and the optimism on that, because that is something that I do think about. Like, oh, is this really where we can be long term? Like, is
right.
California viable?
You think like, right, exactly. But they don't tell you. That is, I really get upset about that. Like, again, about like the past 100 years, like, we've already warmed to this point. It's like, yes, we have already warmed to this point, but we've also built in all these defenses. I mean, we hear it with like all the damage that natural disasters are doing. And it's like, sure, but the damage is being calculated in dollars. And these are where we've built extensively over the past 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
So a hurricane that would have hit Florida in 1910 might have been of a similar strength to a hurricane that hit us recently. But of course, the one that hit us recently is so much more impactful in terms of dollars. Many fewer people die of natural disasters than ever did. Absolutely. Like, there's no question about that. I mean, you might remember about 20 years ago, I believe it was in Indonesia, there was this Boxing Day typhoon or tsunami.
Yeah.
Remember? More than 100,000 people died. I forget exactly what the total number is. That's unthinkable in the United States. We have all these warning systems. We have all this infrastructure built up. We could have major floods in California. That's a total possibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that we've had major wildfires. How many people, like, we had major flooding earlier this month.
Mm-hmm.
How many people died? I think it was like 15. Of course, we don't want anyone to die, but how many would have died in 1850?
Sure.
It would have been hundreds and thousands
Mm-hmm.
in a much smaller population. So I think actually counting the wins, like understanding things in context, it becomes a little maddening, because there's so much to the history of human progress.
Mm-hmm.
It's discounting all the people who are doing what we're doing, which is have had serious-minded conversations about how we can make society better, right? In all different ways. Like, how do we create drainage systems? How do we prevent flooding? People have had that conversation for hundreds of years. People have worked on it. People have done it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know their names. We don't talk about the systems they produced. We don't talk about the lives saved. We don't talk about how many people did not die because of people having these serious discussions about how we can, create a better society.
Yeah.
So there's huge discredit in how news media functions, and we all know it. It's not a political issue. It's not fake news, polemics. The news, it's a bleeds it leads thing, right? The many of the journalists who write about this stuff are not experts. They're not expert scientists. Most of the people who read this stuff are not experts. It becomes this sort of scientists say thing. Scientists say this could get worse. Scientists say this cause. Climate change can be a cause. I'm working on these plants, where I did this thing about Joshua trees, many of which died in the Dome fire in 2020. Not the majority, but a good number. And climate change is an impactor, but it has to do with an invasive species. It has to do with red brome, specifically, this grass that grows in the desert. And the thing is, everything gets caught up in climate change policy, where it's like, no, if you want to save the Joshua tree, 98% of the problem is this thing. So I think there's a lot of misdirection that happens with chaotic thinking. And this idea, it's all about emissions, right? Like that's all the issue that we've got. So I think that there's absolutely a utility in pulling yourself away from too much media consumption, sort of reductive media narratives. Try to speak to scientists. Try to speak to people who are working on issues. Talk to the helpers. I mean, Mr. Rogers says that, right? He says, look for the helpers. When there's a disaster, you look for the helpers. So you talk to people who are working on it.
Yeah.
They're often much more positive than people who are just like sitting in their rooms, doing whatever they do, or just living their lives, I should say.
Sure.
Who are just living their lives and feeling the concern, right? This is what they're concerned about. This is their apocalypticism. But you talk to the people who are making the change, and they become much more aware.
On that note, how can people find you?
Well, so I run a little art school. I mean, that's kind of the primary thing I do. So that's Valley Art Workshop. You can find it Valley Art Workshop on Instagram or .com. And as far as the environmental things I do you mind if I kind of shout out some of my partners? I think
please do. Yeah, please do.
So with the murals that I've done, and the Native Plant Fair, and also what we're doing at CSUN with the exhibit and the concert series, some of our great partners, which I recommend either volunteering with or buying plants from or whatever, if you're in the SoCal area especially, which I imagine is most of your listener audience. There's Tree People, which works on tree cover and tree issues and reforestation. There's the Theodore Payne Foundation, which is a wonderful native plant resource. Kiss the Ground, global advocacy, but specifically America, as far as I understand, on soil health and regeneration and getting our agricultural systems being productive for farmers as well as for our environment. And I think those probably cover my major associations right now.
Amazing. And we can link to all of those in the show notes for everyone. Yeah. So, well, amazing. This has been such a cool conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for listening to the Swap Society podcast. Swap Society is an online clothing swap for women and kids that makes it easy and affordable to mix up your wardrobe sustainably. We're a growing community of women across the USA who are creating positive change by swapping our clothes and slowing down our fashion consumption. We would love to swap with you. If you're interested in joining, you can sign up at our website. Learn more at www.swapsociety.co. That's swapsociety.co. You can find the show notes for each episode on our website. Please get in touch with us on social media too. We're on Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest, and YouTube for the video version of this podcast at Swap Society. Music is by Joel Korlitz and yours truly. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Please help us spread the word by subscribing, leaving a rating and review, sharing on social media, or simply telling a friend. We really appreciate your support. Have a wonderful day, and remember to swap before you shop.